Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is Adina here from Immigrant Finance. And we are so fortunate today to have Gisselle Martinez with us, who is an immigration lawyer. And she's going to be providing in this training slash podcast recording a bit of an overview on immigration law, which is it's actually the first time I'm having a guest come on and share more about immigration law. We usually focus more on the finance side of immigrant finance, but I'm very, very excited to have her expertise here. And so, well, first of all, welcome, Gisselle. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm good. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak about immigration. I'm excited.
Thanks for making the time. I'm really appreciative. And we first connected because Gisselle actually is an alumni of our Immigrant Finance School program. She went through it and was such an amazing contributor to the program and was able to also add a lot of value from her background, answering some questions too. So yeah, I guess you want to kind of tell us about how you found out about immigrant finance and a little bit about your story and connection to immigration.
Sure. So I found immigrant finance. I think it was during the pandemic. I had just finished paying off my car, and I started thinking that I needed to do something more with my money. So I've always been a good saver. So I have that down, but I really think that I needed more than I didn't know what else I was going to do with my money. I was about to buy a house. So that was kind of what I was saving my money for. And then I said, well, what next? Like, what's the next thing I'm going to do with my money? So I'm always on Instagram. So I went on Instagram and I kind of did a search for probably finance or Latino or something related to being an immigrant or being a Hispanic and personal finance. And I found your page, and I think it was like exactly what I was looking for. So that's kind of how I got to you. And one of the things that I kept thinking about for a while was how, as an immigrant and as someone who's Hispanic, how finance is, I know very little about finance, or like how it's different for me, and like the things that I learn about are not really geared to people like me. So I thought your program was perfect, and that's how I decided to join in. I'm glad I did, because I learned a lot.
Oh, thank you so much. And I don't think I knew that story. That's great to hear. I'm really glad you're able to find us and connect. And it was such a pleasure working with you, because you like knew how to manage money in a lot of ways, and like you said, you're a really great saver, and you were very much like, how do I take it to the next level and get started with investing? You did a lot of really great mindset work too to start changing your relationship with money. It was a huge change.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And then you asked me about my connection with immigration. I was born in Colombia, and I came to the U.S. when I was 12 years old with my family. We were eventually able to get our green cards through a family petition, but it did take quite a while to get there. So at some point, I was undocumented myself, and my parents were undocumented. And also, I'm married. My husband is Venezuelan, and he also is an immigrant. He also came when he was around 13 years old, and he was actually DACA until very recently.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so how did that lead you to then become an immigration lawyer? And I know you then founded a nonprofit organization as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think going through the immigration process myself, then my dad had a little bit of a hard time getting his green card, so I actually helped him while I was in law school to apply. I petitioned for him. And my uncle is an attorney, and he did a little bit of a pro bono immigration. So I was helping him since I was young with little things here and there related to immigration law. So when I went to law school, it kind of was the perfect fit of what I wanted to do and what I'm passionate about. I really care about immigrants. I really want to help them, just like my family. So that's how I ended up in immigration. And I opened my own nonprofit after I worked for nonprofits, I worked for private practice. And at some point I decided with my partner, Melissa Martinez, we decided that Orlando needed more nonprofits. So in Florida, there's only 2 courts, one in Orlando, immigration courts. So there's one in Orlando and one in Miami. And Miami has tons of nonprofits that help immigrants, but Orlando only had one. So we thought it was a great idea to open a nonprofit. A nonprofit I used to work for before and shut down because of lack of funding. So we wanted to do something where it would meet that gap where people are not getting the representation, low cost or pro bono representation in immigration court, and in a way where it's sustainable and it's not going to shut down because of lack of funding. So it's been quite an experience in the last 5 years. We've grown the nonprofit a lot. It's called Orlando Center for Justice. And so we keep helping more and more people. So we're pretty proud and excited about the organization.
I was so excited to meet some of your colleagues. I did a little training for Giselle's staff on budgeting that was so fun, and you just had an amazing team. So how many people do you have working for you now in this nonprofit?
So we have a total of 16 people, 6 attorneys, and then 10 support staff.
That is a huge deal. Just for people listening who don't know what that takes, I also work at a nonprofit in my day job as an immigration lawyer, and it is hard work to find that funding for that many people to pay their jobs when it's a nonprofit. Like you're not getting profits, and to be able to help all these people and provide a need, a solution for that gap you identified in Orlando. That's just so incredible and says a lot about you, of what you've been doing to help a lot of people. So thank you again for taking the time to share your knowledge with our community here. And for today, we're going to jump into just a little bit of training to start introducing people in our community more to know about the basics of immigration law. I mean, it's so complicated. So there's only so much we can cover in this conversation, but how would you start off to kind of introduce people the basics of immigration law?
So yeah, I actually do a 101, an immigration 101 with every staff member that comes into my that's working with me. And usually when I do it, it takes about over 2 hours, and I try to go through like a good overview of everything. So we don't want to do that today. So there's so many different ways to be able to get legal status in the United States, although at the same time they're limited, but there's a lot of ways too. So we're talking about like family petitions, there's business petitions or employment visas, investor visas. I don't think we're going to go through those today, so we're going to kind of narrow it down. So I propose to talk about asylum, which is something that I work with all the time, and a lot of my clients that come in, they are seeking asylum, so they're seeking protection from their countries. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about the humanitarian visas, which I believe that a lot of people don't know about. So the U visas, T visas, and VAWAs. But yeah, it'll be hard to go over like a overview of immigration.
Very, very high level.
Yeah. So I don't know if you want me to kind of dive into a little bit of asylum or what.
Well, before we dive in, so you gave a good quick summary of like some of the different types of immigration cases there are, but maybe just to orient people, why do you even need an immigration case? Like how does the immigration system work, and how do people come into contact with immigration law usually?
Right. There are many different ways. So there's people that come into the United States legally, right? They come with a tourist visa or some sort of employment visa, student visa. And then there's people that come into the United States through the border without the documentation. So they have they're EWI, or they enter without inspection sometimes, or sometimes they doesn't mean that they came in hiding, right? Sometimes they actually show up at the border and talk to immigration and let them know that they're seeking asylum, but they don't have a visa to legally come into the United States. So a lot of times that's how clients end up coming to me, for example. And then there's also people who have been here for a very long time, who maybe have never had any connection or any encounter with immigration, but that at this point, maybe they have a family member who can petition for them. And there's also people who are outside and who have family here and who are petitioned by their family to come into the United States from abroad. So from either it could be a parent, a spouse, a child, or even a sibling who can petition for them to come to the United States. That's a whole nother story too of how long it takes, especially for adult children of U.S. citizens and permanent residents. That can take many, many years, depending on the country where they're from. And for siblings, even longer. We're talking about, for Mexico, for example, close to 20 years or more to be able to come into the country, which is one of the things that, sometimes we argue as immigration attorneys, that you hear something about getting to the back of the line, right? And the thing that we want to explain to everyone is that there is no line sometimes, or the line can be 20 years. And a lot of things can happen in the span of 20 years for someone to come in. So my clients come from a variety of places, right? Sometimes they came in with a visa, sometimes came through the border, through a family petition, those kind of sort of ways that they have a connection with immigration.
Thank you. That was really helpful and very concise. Yeah, okay. Please continue jumping into asylum and some of the visas you were talking about.
Sure, no problem.
Yeah.
So I see right now, a lot of my clients are seeking asylum. And then I have clients from where I'm from. We have a lot of Venezuelans seeking asylum and a lot of Central Americans seeking asylum. We don't get that many people from other countries here. Let's say like maybe from Africa. I don't see that many, but I know people are coming from other continents and other countries as well. But the core of my work is Central American and Latin American asylum. So one of the things that I like to explain to everyone, my clients, is that there's this misconception that just because something bad happened to you back in your country, you are gonna get asylum. And unfortunately, the way that the U.S. asylum law is, it's really tough actually to be able to qualify for asylum. Personally, I think it's sometimes very unfair, right? Because I think that people should be protected. If they're seeking their protection, we should kind of look into helping them and protecting them. But because they don't meet this very specific guidelines or elements that the asylum requires, then they might not get asylum. So kind of like, to get a little bit technical, but the definition of asylum, someone to be able to apply for asylum, someone needs to meet the definition of a refugee. So it's a person who is outside of any country of such person's nationality and who's unable or unwilling to return to, and is unable or unwilling to avail themselves of the protection of that country because of persecution or a very well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So what does all that mean? So one of the things is like, what is persecution, right? And that's kind of confusing for a lot of people. What is the meaning of persecution? And even in the case law, everyone is confused. Like, how do you really define persecution? So just because something bad happened to you doesn't mean that you're going to meet the requirement, the meaning of persecution. Normally, at least I think across the country, courts define it differently depending on where you are. But for example, where I'm from in Florida, we're in the 11th Circuit. Persecution requires more than just threats, right? So it doesn't require physical harm, but it does require a level of harm that was done to the person. Either it could be psychological, intimidation, and they look at kind of the cumulative effect of what happened to the person. I have sometimes people who were threatened, who come to me and they come to the United States because they are afraid. But if the threats are maybe isolated, maybe happen once and they don't really know why it was done to them, who did it, maybe after the threat they still lived a couple of years in their country without issue, that is going to be problematic to be able to get asylum. The courts and or the agencies are not necessarily going to find persecution in that respect. But again, I think the other thing is that people think, oh, something really bad must have happened to me. Maybe I must have been shot or beat up, and that's also not necessary. So if there's a list of bad things that or harm that people did to you, you could meet the definition of persecution. But then the problem with asylum is that not only do you have to meet the definition of persecution or have been persecuted, but that persecution is to have a connection or a nexus or be on account of those 5 grounds, right? The race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or a political opinion. And that's where I see a lot of issues with the way my clients explain their cases. I see it a lot with my Venezuelan clients who tend to be a lot more educated and sometimes decide to file their asylums on their own, or maybe with the assistance of a paralegal, not an attorney. And they end up not explaining really well what happened to them and why it happened to them. So like that, why was someone hurting you or doing those things to you? If you're not able to articulate that it had a connection with your political opinion, for example, in the case of Venezuelans, then you're not gonna get asylum. A lot of them sometimes are surprised, right, that they didn't get asylum, even though like all these bad things happened to them.
It's often the hardest piece to prove, and really what requires good lawyering. So I think you're right to identify, like, you really do need to work with a lawyer and get support, because it doesn't make sense in terms of common sense how to describe these things. You're like fitting it into these boxes that the law has created. And particularly for people, what I've noticed, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is the law has not caught up with the reality of why most people are fleeing persecution today. So that's kind of why we have to work these mental gymnastics almost to like fit someone's story into a way it can get granted for asylum, right?
Definitely. It's definitely an issue that I see, especially with my Central American clients and those who are fleeing domestic violence and gang persecution, because the law, like I say, the law sometimes doesn't really allow for those people, even though they really are fear for their lives and they really could even die if they were to go back. But the way that the law is being interpreted, it doesn't fit people like them for some reason. So it can get very frustrating, especially the domestic violence cases for me are extremely sad when I hear really bad cases and I feel we might not even win, even though this person suffered tremendously when in their country.
We were just talking about before we started recording, there was this terrible case that came out under the Trump administration to try to end asylum for women fleeing gender-based violence. And thankfully it's been now overturned. But a lot of people really were harmed by that decision and the fallout. And I worked on a lot of those cases too. It's awful.
Right. Yeah. That's one of the cases I'm working on an appeal where when I prepared my client for the hearing and I knew I wasn't going to win because of the way the case law was at the time, I really broke down. Hearing the terrible things that she went through, sexual abuse, physical abuse by several people in her life as a child, and hearing those stories and thinking, I'm going to go into court and I'm not going to win this case.
Yeah.
So, hopefully now with the new case law, I'll be able to appeal and get the case back on track. But it was very frustrating, and it's still going to be probably, frustrating and difficult going forward although a little easier with the new case law.
Yeah, it's hard work. This is really hard work. I'm glad you're kind of giving people a picture of what it's like to actually fight these cases. I mean, it can really be like going to war when you're going to immigration court, fighting for someone, and the law is completely designed against them. But yeah, so what would you say for people who, maybe they've been in this country a long time, and they just kind of assume that there's no option for them because what you described, like the line doesn't actually exist and all that, but they may be kind of afraid to go back home. What kind of steps could someone take to figure out if they could have an asylum claim?
Well, one of the things that it'll be difficult for someone who's been here for a long time because of the 1-year deadline for asylum. So if you must file asylum within 1 year of coming to the United States, and there's a few exceptions to this. One of them is if there's changed circumstances, right? So if your things in your country change since you came in, perhaps you could apply for asylum now. Now there is other protections that don't require the 1-year deadline, like withholding of removal or Convention Against Torture, but those are, I think, a little much harder to get than asylum sometimes. But going back to, it's so important to see an attorney for this and get that guidance from an attorney, because we might be able to, perhaps maybe you've been here for a long time, but if you're afraid to go back, an attorney could review your case and figure out that you do qualify for asylum or withholding, and there is some hope to remain here with the protection of the United States.
Yeah, and I'll put a link below to the American Immigration Lawyers Association directory where you can look up lawyers in your area if that's something of interest. Great. And I think you were going to also give us a little overview of U visas, T visas, VAWA. How do those work?
Right. So I love U visas. Well, sometimes I'll explain why. So U visas, they're all pretty similar in that they're protecting people who have been victims here inside of the United States, as opposed to asylum, where you have to have the harm had to have happened outside of the United States. So to go over the U visa is visas for victims of crime inside of the United States, who assist the police in the investigation of that crime. The important things about the U visa is that not just any crime qualifies. So normally it has to be a crime against the person. One of the examples I always give is sometimes clients tell me, well, I ask them, have you been a victim of a crime in the United States? And they say, well, one time someone came into my house and stole everything, but I wasn't there. So that most likely is not going to qualify because that was a crime against the person's property and not directly against the person. But things like domestic violence, I see a lot, aggravated battery, kidnapping, rape, sexual assault. Those are the types of crimes. And there's a long list. This is just a small list I'm naming that could allow you to qualify for a U visa. And the purpose of the U visa was to encourage immigrants to be able to report those crimes to the police and not fear that they're going to be deported or put in immigration detention if they don't report the crime. So it really helps communities stay safer by allowing immigrants to report the crime. One of the kind of challenges for the U visa is that you need to have reported the crime to the police, or not the police, the authorities in general, and you need to have a certification from a law enforcement agency that you assisted. And that's where I ran into a lot of issues sometimes where there's no requirement for this law enforcement to sign. I've had law enforcement tell me that they don't help immigrants. We don't help immigrants here. So they just don't sign. I have them say, well, I don't need them anymore in the case, so why sign? Which is not what's the requirement for the U visa. The U visa asks for the person to assist in the investigation. They don't ask that they be needed right now for the case. So that's a challenge. But the good thing about the U visa is that it has a pathway to residency and citizenship. And it does forgive a lot of things that normally in immigration are not forgiven, like entering without inspection to the border, having a prior deportation orders, having some criminal issues, and that it could still be waived through the U visa. So those are the positives. Another negative is that it takes forever to get a U visa right now. It takes about 6 years, 5 to 6 years to get the U visa. And meanwhile, my clients, just have to keep waiting. This year actually changed it. Now they're hopefully going to get a work permit while they wait, which was not
that's amazing.
case. Yeah.
That's a big difference.
Yes, this is definitely going to make a big difference, because a lot of times, unfortunately, with my clients, like I would say, well, I kind of file it, but see you in 6 years when they finally adjudicate it. So now at least they'll be able to get some sort of benefit while they wait all those years.
Definitely. Let me pause you right there, because that is like such a connection for immigrant finance. Whenever there's something with like financial issues and immigration law, so important to highlight, because we all know how important the right to work is. And, lots and lots of people have to work to survive, even if they don't have a work permit. But if you can get access to a work permit, it's going to just give you a lot more options, and also hopefully put you in a situation where, you have more rights also at work, right? So think about too how that comes in with immigration law, and how that can be a way to have more financial options. There's also a work permit someone can apply for when they're applying for the asylum that Gisselle was mentioned earlier. That can be very complicated, though, the timing of that.
I know. And it got more complicated in the last administration, but
Yeah. Do you have anything on that to add, actually, on the process for a work permit when you're applying for asylum?
So it's been a struggle for in the last few years. So it used to be that after 180 days, if the case was still pending, my clients would get a work permit. Mm-hmm. Then they changed it during the Trump administration to be 365 days, and all these additional requirements in the form. So they made it super difficult to be able to get a work permit. Right now, it's still difficult, but it got a little easier with some class action lawsuits that happened. Mm-hmm. So again, if you see an attorney, it'll be easier for the attorney to be able to help you get your work permit. But some of my clients are waiting over a year now after even you file. There's some delays in immigration
Wow.
to
even
be able
with the class actions.
Right. Wow. Yeah. So that was unfortunate as well.
Definitely. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what about, was it VAWAs next?
Right, sure. Yeah, I'll talk about VAWA. So VAWAs are similar to the U visas, and sometimes people get them confused, but VAWA is for the Violence Against Women Act, and it helps immigrants who are victims of domestic violence and who are married to U.S. citizens or permanent residents. And that benefit is it allows them to be able to get a green card, even if their spouse does not want to help them get the green card. They got separated from their spouse because of domestic violence. The important thing, something that I see a lot, that people have this misconception through VAWA. Well, there's a few, but one of them too is that because it has women in the name, people think that it only applies to women, but it also applies to men who are victims of domestic violence. Mm-hmm. And then there's this misconception that like you have to report it like the U visa, but that's not the case. You could get a VAWA even if you never reported the abuse to the police or to any courts. The other kind of misconception that I've seen with VAWA is that it has to be physical abuse, right? And a lot of people have that misconception that to be a victim of violence or domestic violence, it has to be physical abuse. And that is not the case at all. So VAWA includes mental, emotional, psychological abuse, which sometimes it's hard to recognize. So that's something else that as attorneys we're able to help the client get the proper evidence to prove that even though they were never physically abused, they were psychologically abused, and there's this concept of the power and control that is exercised. This people, spouses exercise this power and control, with economic, not letting the person leave the house, not letting them have friends. That could still qualify as abuse for VAWA purposes. So I think that's important to note, because a lot of people maybe don't know they're in an abusive relationship just because they've never been physically abused. But in general, just again, the great thing about VAWA is that the person will be able to get a green card if they're able to prove those things.
Great. And what about T visas?
So T visa, same thing, similar to the U visa, but in this case, it's for victims of trafficking, of human trafficking. And so there's two types of human trafficking that it protects. So there's sex trafficking and labor trafficking. When it comes to sex trafficking, it is a little easier to identify because if someone is forced to have sexual relations in exchange for money, you can easily identify that the person suffers sex trafficking sometimes. In the case of labor trafficking, that is very complicated. And even for me as an attorney, I didn't really know much until not too long what it entailed for labor trafficking. And actually, I think that has a connection to immigrant finance, in that as immigrants, we are taught to work really hard, right? So sometimes many immigrants that they don't know better. They think they're just working hard, right? They have to work hard to be able to get money, and they don't realize that they're in this trafficking situation where they have terrible working conditions. They have extremely long hours. They don't get paid sometimes. Maybe sometimes they don't get a check, or sometimes the employer maybe provides housing and food, so they charge so much for housing and food that at the end the person doesn't have that much money left over for themselves. And again, maybe you think you're just working hard, but in reality you're being trafficked. You're being a victim of human trafficking. So that's something really important to note. So if you have been in that situation of being a victim of sex trafficking or labor trafficking, you do have to report this to the authorities. But the good thing about the T visa or the U visa is that you don't need the certification necessarily. It's helpful, but you don't need it. So then we don't have to deal with agencies who don't want to help immigrants, as long as you're able to prove that you tried to report that to the police or to the authorities. And same thing as the U visa, eventually you will be able, has a pathway to residency and citizenship as well if your T visa gets approved.
That's really interesting. I never thought of T visas with the connection with immigrant finance. That's such a good point. I mean, now that you say it, I can think of a lot of people I've talked to who might be eligible for a T visa.
Right. It's something that I think we're underutilizing as immigration attorneys, and that we don't know enough of. And I'm a big guilty of this too, where something that I didn't know about, and I started kind of learning a little bit more. And I think now at this point that I might have talked in the past with people that could have qualified for a T visa, and I didn't know to check for that.
Do you know, because I imagine some people have this question, like, do you have to actually be not paid and have a paycheck withheld, or can it be more general abusive conditions?
And I don't know that many T visas, so I don't know all the, but I'm not sure, but it maybe, there has to be this level of like fraud and coercion that to be in that situation too. I don't know for sure though the answer.
Yeah. Well, just to round it out, I mean, you're just making me think of, like, again, just how important it is to take steps to be financially empowered when you're an immigrant, because even if, you don't fit under that type of visa that you just described, the T visa, because the labor abuse situation hasn't risen to that level, there are always things you can do on your own to get your finances more in order so you can have more control, whether it be like just starting to budget for the first time so you can start to save $10 a month or whatever you can do to like save up to get out of that situation, or give yourself a month where you can go in between jobs to find a better job with the employer is going to treat you better, or just like starting, like kind of like having an emergency fund, similar idea. I'm thinking of hearing you talk when my husband moved here, Mao, and the first few years he was in this country, he was treated really, really terribly by his employers. And I don't think there was fraud or coercion necessarily, but I mean, there were times he would come home crying because he'd been treated so terribly. And I know a lot of you I talked to go through that. So just think about, like, if you're in that situation, it's so hard to imagine yourself empowered, but there are baby steps you can take to start to get out of that. And finances is a really important tool from what I've seen. I don't know if you have anything to add or on that piece.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many issues that come with being an immigrant, right? You don't speak the language, you don't know how things work in the United States. You might think it's normal, maybe in your country it's normal, right, to work that many hours, or that sometimes you don't get paid. I know, like, I'm from Colombia, and I know I have family members that's like, oh yeah, they didn't pay me this month or something. And to us, it's like, what? Like, everyone should be paid every month, but in some countries it might be normal. But here in the United States, it could be a situation where it's labor trafficking. So that's something to always be mindful of, and knowing your rights in the workplace is important.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for sharing this really helpful introduction for people to start learning a little bit more about immigration law and some of their options. Really appreciate it. Where can people learn more about the great work you're doing in Orlando? Maybe donate to your nonprofit, support you all.
Sure. So we have a website. It's orlandojustice.org. We do have Instagram, which is at Orlando Center for Justice. And then we do have Facebook, Orlando Center for Justice, as well. We are actually having a 5K fundraiser in January, which we're excited about. So if anyone is in Orlando, if they want to sign up, and we take donations. Any help, any little bit helps.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day.